mourns the loss of the visionary who took Apple from zero to hero. But how will the tech giant cope with life after Steve Jobs? This week, Click looks back at the life of the co-founder of Apple, Steve Jobs, who died on Wednesday. We'll hear from his colleagues and critics, and we'll ask what next for Apple without his guiding hand. All that plus the latest tech news and the very best of the web in Webscape. Welcome to Click. I'm Spencer Kelly, and welcome to the Apple Store in London. You know, the world of technology doesn't have many celebrities, but Steve Jobs was exactly that. A businessman whose death has prompted the same kind of outpourings of grief more normally reserved for superstars, heads of state, and even religious leaders. And it was with a kind of messianic zeal that he inspired millions of devoted fans around the world and led the company that he founded to world domination.
We're going to make some history together today.
The man and the company have become synonymous. Jobs' stage appearances were as iconic as the products they launched. His trademark black roll neck, blue jeans and white trainers may not have been the height of fashion, but the form he insisted his products take became exactly that. Think of Apple in the 21st century and three devices spring to mind, and they all begin with I.
And that product is called iPod.
And we are calling it iPhone.
And we call it the iPad.
You could be forgiven for thinking that Steve Jobs invented the digital music player, the smartphone and the tablet. But actually, all of these devices were already around in some form or other, and they were largely rubbish. What Apple did do under Jobs' leadership was to reimagine, reinvent and rework these ideas from the ground up. The secret of success was simplicity and style. The iPod made navigating thousands of music tracks easier and sexier using a wheel rather than those clunky buttons which characterized existing MP3 players. And with the accompanying software, iTunes, Apple had a revolutionary combination. iTunes proved not just an easy way of stuffing an iPod with your own music, but later the gateway to a world of purchased music through the iTunes Store, a move which the music industry initially welcomed as a way of stemming illegal file sharing, but then grew to resent as Apple's dominance in the area took hold. Not content with upending the music industry, Jobs turned his sights on the phone market. Until 2007, smartphone and PDA users were doomed to navigate their different apps using either a physical keypad or tapping delicately on a pared-down version of Windows. That is, until the arrival of the iPhone, with a sensitive dual-touch screen, new appealing user interface and, crucially, an app store, again easily accessible from within iTunes, turning a cottage industry of app developers into a mass-market proposition. And despite doubts from many in the industry, including yours truly, Apple did what Microsoft had failed to do several years earlier and made tablet computing genuinely desirable, and throwing the ailing newspaper industry a lifeline in the process. For each device, Jobs insisted on a stylish design and simple operation. They also needed to be reliable, and for that reason he made sure Apple hardware was always locked down. They only worked with iTunes. Third-party software wasn't allowed to sync with them. Heck, you couldn't even open them up to change the battery.
What they want to do by controlling the ecosystem is ensure a really great user experience. Remember, Apple is all about interface. They're all about great user experience. And they don't trust anyone outside their sphere to provide as good a user experience as they do.
Jobs was known in the industry for his confidence in his own ideas. He ignored focus groups and market research, instead trusting his own gut instinct to help decide what the public wanted.
Almost all the time that we had discussions about how something should be done in a company, he was almost always right, and he had thought it out, and he had thought out why a product should go to the left instead of to the right. Common sense. knowing what made sense in a product, what wasn't going to sell and what was going to sell, and when you should implement a new technology and be ahead of the world, and when maybe you should be a little bit of a follower.
And it was with this man, Steve Wozniak, that Steve Jobs first began to write history. The two met at an amateur computer club in the early 70s, and in 1976 they formed Apple Computer and created the Apple I, which users had to build themselves, and shortly afterwards the vastly more popular, ready out of the box, Apple II.
When Apple started, up till Apple started, we were very similar. And when it started, his direction was to go into running a corporation, learning how to run every little aspect and be in control and be in charge and the main thinker in a company. And mine was just to do excellent engineering for, my phase of the role. So from that point in time, we were like different people in different categories. I'm shy. I don't want to run things. I don't want the big highlight world. I like to stay in the background. Steve wasn't like a laboratory guy. Part of the problem was he was around me, his best friend, and I could just design anything and build it up and write all the code, and so he never did the real right down to the guts of the technology, the actual design, hardware, software. But managing it, understanding it, knowing who's got the true stories and who doesn't about what is possible and which technologies are good and can be applied to a new product. And he's also the sort of person who would see a technology and think this is what it can give a real person in the world, a user. So psychology-wise, he related so well to the users, the buyers of products. So marketing, I would say, was his greatest strength.
And it was these qualities which shifted the Apple II in its droves and made the two Steves rich in the process by proving that real people wanted computers. And it was also his ability as a salesman that persuaded the boss of Pepsi to come in and run the operation.
He looked up at me with these very penetrating eyes. He said, "Do you really want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?"
We shall prevail. On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh.
The two Steves plus one John went on to launch the Macintosh, one of the first personal computers to use a mouse, and this was long before Microsoft launched Windows. But the problem was that original Mac didn't sell anywhere near as well as Steve Jobs had hoped.
Steve was always also a little bit afraid of competition and trying to push ahead, and we had to get there before somebody else does, and we have to go in the new technology direction, and we have to believe that our way is right even though they're sticking with the old way. The Macintosh experience hurt him a lot because we took the good approach to computers having mouses and menus, whereas all the PCs running on Microsoft software were going to stick with the old way. And it just, why didn't the world go the new way? Why didn't Microsoft go the new, better way? And it was probably just too expensive, for what they could do at the time.
As Apple hit hard times, John Sculley forced Jobs out.
To infinity and beyond!
But he didn't disappear into the ether. He bought Pixar Animation, the company behind, again, some of the most iconic and pioneering movies of the last 15 years. In 1997, Jobs returned to Apple as an advisor, and a year later, that maverick attitude to breaking the mold was back in force with the release of the iMac, a personal computer that was nothing like the dull, beige boxes that ran Windows. It was critically lauded, but it didn't make much of a dent on Windows' stranglehold on the PC market. But even so, it gave Apple's board the confidence to make Jobs CEO 2 years later.
And what came next? All those eyes.
However, not all Apple's creations have been successes. For example, Ping, the iTunes-based social network, and Apple TV, the video-on-demand service. And the MacBook Air was a triumph of form over function.
And that brings us full circle in Steve Jobs' rise and fall and rise at Apple. Now, his time at the top may have been very successful, but his style of management was certainly very controversial.
He was a demanding, autocratic boss, known for his rants at staff if things weren't done to a high enough standard. However, many of the people that worked for him remained faithful.
I'll tell you what I think the secret of Apple's success is. It's having a single guy at the top who does not harbor disagreements. They don't do things by committee. And having one person's vision drive the whole ship is hugely important and is not available in any other company. I mean, there's nothing else like that. And what it means is they can do things so much faster and so much more efficiently. They just waste a lot less time spinning their wheels.
And in order to make sure his product launches gained maximum attention, he also demanded absolute secrecy beforehand.
The hardware team doesn't know what the software team is doing, and vice versa. So often they'll find out when Steve Jobs takes a stage at Macworld and shows the public and also members of the company at the same time what exactly they've been working on. So the one hand, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And they go to extreme lengths to set that up. That the software programmers will be writing software for a device which they don't even know the dimensions of.
And with no genuine information coming out of Apple's HQ, the Apple rumour mill goes into overdrive every time there's the faintest whiff of a new product. Even this week, many in the industry have managed to convince themselves that the iPhone 5 was about to be launched. Some couldn't mask their disappointment at the actual announcement, the 4S, despite it sporting considerable tweaks under the hood, like the 8-megapixel camera and the 1080p high-def video recording, along with the iPad processor inside and a new voice control system called Siri. But overall, the secrecy, the cool designs and the mystique surrounding Jobs himself has helped to create the cult of Apple. Loyal followers who would whoop and cheer at press conferences and queue for hours to be one of the first to get their hands on the latest device. Steve Jobs leaves them without a figurehead, but he leaves the company that he founded the second most valuable in the world. Now, even as we look back at Steve Jobs' life, Apple itself is forced to look forward to the future. So what does that hold for the company? Well, Karen Haslam is the editor of Macworld magazine. She joins us now. Karen, welcome to Click.
Hi.
You've also represented Apple as a press officer before, so you, more than many people, are qualified to talk about what they're like to deal with. First and most important, though, what is next for Apple? Where does it go from here?
Well, Steve Jobs was ill for a long time. He was first diagnosed with cancer back in 2004 and was off for a long period back then. So it's not a new thing to the company to be thinking about a future without him. He had a team of executives working with him that he'd crafted in his own image. He had them working the way that he wanted them to work, and they've been well taught. So this is a group of people who, yes, Steve Jobs is difficult to replace because he's unique. People like him don't come along very often. A genius, But what you've got at Apple is a team of people who can fulfill different parts of what Steve Jobs brought to the company. So without Steve Jobs, you have a number of people ready to fill his shoes.
It is rare, isn't it, for the success of such a big company to be tied just to one man, isn't it?
Well, Apple's very much Steve Jobs' company. He founded the company with Steve Wozniak. He was the momentum behind everything in the early days. And having lost the company once when he was ousted back in '85, and then coming back, he made the decisions to drive the company forwards. It was his company, it was his baby. But there are many people at Apple who made the products as good as they are. Jonathan Ives, a guy from the UK, he's the guy behind the design. What Steve Jobs brought to Apple was somebody who would say, this is what's about to happen, and we're going to drive this idea forwards, and we're going to make a product that people love.
Do you think that is the reason that Apple was so successful? Because it was driven by just one person. There was no confusion, there were no focus groups, there were no arguments at management level, if you like. It was just the voice of the one man.
Yeah, I mean, there must have been a certain element of what Steve says goes. And I expect a lot of that is because when he was ousted from the company in the 80s, that was the time he was 30. They perhaps weren't taking him seriously as a sort of leader. And when he came back, he was determined not to let somebody else tell him what to do. So for years, he would have been making those decisions and perhaps not trusting people to make them without him. But then in 2004, when he got ill, it would have been a wake-up call that he needs to start passing over those responsibilities. He needs to work with his executives and to you know, craft them in the way that he wants them to work and to represent him. So I think, you know, we've had many, many years of him being able to do that and taking a step away.
Karen Haslam, the editor of Macworld. And that is it from us for this week. If you'd like more Click, then head on over to our website. bbc.co.uk/click is the address you need. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.